Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the publishing director of Random House Graphic, a soon-to-arrive graphic novel imprint. It's Gina Gagliano. Thanks for coming on, Gina.
Thanks, David. It's good to be here. Thanks for asking me.
So I'm very excited to talk about Random House Graphic and everything that's going on there because I think it's just a gigantic deal. But I want to start with your path to getting there, not all the way back to like your childhood or anything like that. But when I was doing my research, I came across something that I thought was really interesting, and it was your introduction to comics proper through the Reed College Comics Library, which seems like a really amazing place. So how did you went to the college at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. How did that library introduce you to the wider world of comics?
Yeah. So thanks for having me here. And I'm super excited to talk about all things comics with you, including my origin story. So the school that I went to get my bachelor's degree at, Reed College, is a very small liberal arts college. It's, as you said, in Portland, Oregon. And it somehow is actually sort of like a comics nexus, because Lee Walton, who does marketing and publicity and editorial at Top Shelf, was a year behind me in school. And Angie Wang, who's working on Steven Universe and co-runs Comics Arts LA, went there also, as did Jeremy Millo, who is a comics translator who works with Archaea, and Lucy Bellwood, who does comics about sailboats and is part of the Portland Comics Collective that keeps changing their names, so I can't remember what they're called anymore.
Helioscope.
Yes. They used to be called Periscope, and now they're called Helioscope, which is kind of a mystery to me, but very cool. Anyway, so it's really curious to me how all these people ended up at this school, because it doesn't have a comics program. And I ended up there. My bachelor's degree is in anthropology, and I kind of stumbled on comics at this college when I was basically looking for anything like science fiction, fantasy, light reading to read. And the school library is very nice, but it's super academic. Like, you could go there and find a lot of classic Russian literature. You could go there and find Dickens. You could find all this stuff. But I was like, I'm the person who reads a book a day. I cannot read classic Russian literature. Where are the dragons in this library? And the library told me about the student-run comics library where they've been collecting comics since the 60s, that is on campus, that is open 24 hours a day with a key card. And so I went there and I was like, okay, I've heard of some of these prose authors who are writing comics. Like, I've heard of Neil Gaiman before, and I've heard of the X-Men. We're going to start reading. So I ended up running the library for 2 years. And I also had a 2-day-a-week internship with Dark Horse, which is in Milwaukee, right outside Portland, my senior year of college, too.
Yeah, that is one of the things that really kind of astonishes me about that whole origin story, is the fact that, I first off, I love comic origin stories and like how people got into it, because everyone kind of started in their own way. There's like a lot of commonalities between these stories, but the fact that there's this small college in Portland, Oregon, that has this living, breathing, evolving comics library that has this like legacy of people who have worked in comics, like Lee, like Lucy Bellwood, et cetera, is really, it's kind of astonishing. It's like one of those random things in the world of comics that as soon as I read it, I was like, wow, that is really cool. I love that.
It was pretty good. It was definitely a school experience that I did not expect, and one that actually led me directly into being able to get a job, which I feel like is not the outcome of a lot of people's undergraduate education today. So I feel very lucky. I feel very lucky that I went to school and I was like, I don't know anything about this. And I knew I wanted to work in publishing, but I did not read comics. I didn't know anything about comics. And then I went to school and I learned all about them. I had internships, and 6 months after I graduated, I had a job at First Second.
That's amazing. So you said you went to school for anthropology. It seems like you're not just somebody that has worked a lot in marketing and publicity. You actually genuinely really love it. Like it's something that you really enjoy. How did you start? Was that purely because of your role at First Second, or was it something that was always kind of a fascination for you?
So I also was one of the kids who grew up thinking that the only job in publishing was being an editor. Like I did not understand that marketing and publicity exists. I didn't understand what was involved with it. I definitely had the idea of being an editor as checking people's like comics for spelling and grammar mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I when I was at Dark Horse, that's editorial is what I did there. I worked in their editorial department as an intern. And I graduated from school thinking editorial was really a space I wanted to be in because I liked working with authors. I liked working with, the editorial staff of people who's excited and super passionate about comics or any other kind of books. And, I put my resume together and it ended up on the desk of Mark Siegel, who's the creative director of First Second. And he called me up and he was like, I have a marketing job open. Will you come in and interview for it? And I came in and I was like, I haven't really done marketing. Uh, the stereotypical thing about anthropology is it's the liberal arts degree you get when you don't want to have like the something as like cheap, quote unquote cheap as a marketing degree. It's
Ooh,
like
that wounds me. That wounds me.
yes, that's why I'm saying quote unquote. But I went to the sort of school where like the majors were like literature, history, Latin, science. So like there wasn't a such thing as a marketing degree or a communications degree or a degree in computer science like at the college that I went to. Um, so the people at my school, I just remember thinking about marketing and being like, this is like using anthropology, which is the study of people,
Mm-hmm.
using it for evil.
That is, it's funny because when you said anthropology, I was like, that is kind of a natural leap over to marketing in a lot of ways. I had not associated with moving towards evil, but I think it's probably accurate.
Well, yeah, it's just the idea of kind of like taking this academic thing where you study people for the like opening up windows on other people's culture and maybe writing a paper about them and maybe like making people's lives a better place through it and like using it to sell things to them.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's where the evil came in.
Oh yeah.
Um, but really I got into marketing and publicity starting at First Second and working with the marketing and publicity director of First Second's parent company, Roaring Brook. And her name's Lauren Wall, and she's retired at this point. She and I just talked on the phone last week, the week before last week, I think. And she's really great. She'd been around in the industry forever. Um, she basically had retired, and then Simon Boughton founded Roaring Brook and was like, "Hey, do you want to come and work a few days a week over here at Roaring Brook? Like while you're retired, because probably being retired is boring." And she was like, "Sure, this is amazing." So she was just a great mentor to me, and connected me with so many people in the book publishing industry. And when that happened, I got to meet all of these booksellers and librarians and teachers and reporters like you.
Mm-hmm.
I got to kind of just like talk to all of these great comic store owners and found that there's so many people who love comics so much and loved books so much that as a marketing and publicity person, I basically got to talk to them all the time about the books that I was working on and how cool they were. And I really like doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and at the same time, when First Second started up, it was very small. So I also, one of the things that was my responsibility was looking at all the books in translation and checking the edits, like the translation on them, and seeing if it was right or wrong. And not that my non-English languages are great, but it was more like, does this make sense? Does it sound good? Does it flow well? Does it need to be rewritten? Like, what is happening with this? And translation editing, I feel like, is a type of editing that does not work very well with my brain because it doesn't involve any like working with authors and kind of thinking about the big picture. It's just like word by word, like checking of a text and kind of like thinking about it purely on like a line editing level.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, look, I could talk to these amazing booksellers and people who run conventions and librarians and basically like all these people who are so passionate about comics that they have these jobs just working with comics all the time, or I could line edit things.
Right.
And clearly talking to people about comics, if you're talking to people who love comics and are really passionate about them, are super excited to work with you on organizing cool things, won out over line editing.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I want to talk about that time during First Second, because it was, I mean, First Second, when you joined, if I understand correctly, had not even released a book yet, right?
Yeah, I started there 6 months before they started publishing anything.
That's amazing. But I mean, so not only were you joining a brand new publisher, one that hadn't even, really existed before then, you also were coming into comics during a time where like the Scholastic Graphics launched the same year you joined First Second. And so
Yeah,
like,
it was 2005.
what's that?
It was 2005.
Yeah. So in the grand scheme of things, really even like the market that First Second existed in wasn't even really developed at that point. So to top that all off, you had never worked in marketing before. So what was the learning curve for that? Like, what was from that experience? Like, what was the biggest thing you had to learn about working in comics, and specifically this realm of comics?
Yeah, I mean, it was basically everything. Like there was so much to learn and to do. I mean, luckily starting at a place 6 months before they published anything kind of gave me some time to get a handle on the books, to get a handle on the systems at Macmillan, to get a handle on the staff, to get a handle on the industry. And at that point I was really working intensely with Lauren, who's the Roaring Brook marketing and publicity director, who was kind of setting the like the plans and the campaigns, and then I would work with her to figure out how to put them together. But I mean, definitely I wasn't doing anything like I am today. It was a lot of like, okay, first figure out how to mail things, and then you can figure out how to like write the letters that go along with mailing things. And yep.
It was, I was telling you before we started recording that I was listening to an episode of your podcast, Graphic Novel TK, that you and Allison Wilgus did with Tucker Stone, who works for Consortium and previously worked with Nobrow and a bunch of other things. And one of the things I thought was really interesting about that I think a lot of people don't realize, is when you were talking about the very extended window that a lot of books that are aimed at the book market have to go through. Like pre-sales start at 12 months out. Pre-sales being actually, can you explain pre-sales really quick by chance?
Yeah. So the first meeting that at Random House, marketing and publicity really interacts with the book is the launch meeting. Um, our launch meeting for Spring 20, which at Random House is a season that goes from January to um, the end of April, was 2 weeks ago at the beginning of February
Mm-hmm.
2019. So, like 11 months before the season happens. So, following that meeting, where I and the editorial and design team present the books and talk to people about what they are and what our hopes are, what we want to happen with them, the marketing and publicity team then goes away and thinks about how to make that happen. If looking at the books, they have other ideas about what they can do with them, if they think that something different should happen with them. And then we get back together and kind of have that conversation of what are you thinking? What are you thinking? Does this kind of match up with how our expectations for the books are?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that that extended timeline and like the pre-sales element and things like that are, for a lot of comic fans, like straightforward, long-term comic fans, they think of comics in this 3-month window that the direct market dictates. And so like you dealing with such an elongated plan or period, I imagine that's a really interesting wrinkle to the whole publishing. I mean, granted, that's where the way that the book market in general works, but it's really fascinating because it seems like you would have to constantly be thinking short and long term once you get rolling. And it
Oh,
would,
definitely.
yeah, and it would require a lot of organization on your part.
Yeah. There's a lot of writing things down and having Excel charts and, having a once monthly, let's look back at the plans, hour long block scheduled on Friday to make sure you didn't forget any of the things that you said you're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and then a lot of just checks and balances where you plan to do things and then you constantly keep it in touch with all the other people who are involved in the book to kind of like make sure you all remember that the things are happening and on your radar and kind of still unfolding and developing.
Yeah. Well, and that's, I mean, that's one of the interesting things about like when you left for a second, you officially, I believe, left like in May.
Mhm.
And the interesting thing about that is the work that you were doing for books in for First Second probably is almost still being felt.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the last season that I kind of had really started working on in the middle of May last year was the winter 20 season, which at First Second is January through the end of April
Hmm.
20. Sorry, the January through the end of April 19. It was the whatever the season is right now, winter 19. Um, so there's that. But I also, did acquisition plans for books that First Second was signing up. I at First Second, like at Random House Graphic, the whole process is very collaborative. So we would all talk about books signing up, and part of that conversation was like, what is this going to take to work well in the market? And that was part of the conversation that I would bring to the table there.
Hmm. So it seems to me that, because the collaborative element of it, and maybe because First Second wasn't gigantic in its own right, it seems that your role there, which ostensibly was the associate director of marketing and publicity when you left, was a lot more than that. It like evolved to be a more kind of almost holistic role where you touched on other things as well.
Yeah, I mean, when I left First Second was an 8-person team,
Hmm.
and you know part of the great thing about working for a tiny publisher is that you do get to step outside your like strict job boundaries and do some of all the things.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and that's something that I find to be really fun.
Hmm. I have to admit, my day job at this advertising agency I work at is in online social media. But I actually, like, for one of my clients, I recently scripted a series of digital videos for them where I actually even performed in one of them. And
Oh, fun.
yeah, and I'm not going to say that I was like any great shakes or anything like that, but people did seem to like it. And it's really funny because then people are seeing the video on Facebook and on YouTube and things like that, and they're commenting towards me. And I don't know, it's always fun being able to, spread your wings and try some different things, because that's kind of how you challenge yourself to be better.
Yeah, I also just like having a lot of different things to do, because if I get tired of doing one thing, or if I try really hard on one thing and I get really frustrated, or if I get really bored with something, I know that I can just completely switch directions and start planning a conference
Right.
rather than soliciting book blurbs. And that I find really freeing of a job structure.
Yeah, you seem like somebody who's never lacked in things that they wanted to do. I actually didn't realize until I researched this that you had done, like, for example, programming for TCAF and like coming up with like the panels and things like that. That is a very daunting side hustle, so to speak.
Oh, it's so fun though. I mean, I I don't know. I really like the thing where you break down okay, there's 8 venues, and if we start the panels half an hour after the thing opens and we have 5-minute breaks between them, how many panels does that mean we can have total?
Mm-hmm.
And which are the best for which space? And how do we cover all the topics that we need to cover at this conference and not have anyone doing 2 panels that are at the same time?
Unless they have a time turner, they're going to be in deep trouble.
Yeah. But the people at the Toronto Comics Art Festival, Chris Butcher, Miles Baker, Andrew Townsend, Andrew Woodrow Butcher, they're all fantastic, and I think that show is great. And I just I started working out for a second, and when I was just like kind of in the beginning of my career, I volunteered on weekends at the Museum of Comic and Cartoon Art.
Mm-hmm.
So I think on Saturday I ran the museum, and I put together the library, and I ran their programming, and then they closed, and I was like, I need something else to do. And so I talked to Chris, and he was kind enough to let me look at the programming for TCAF and help with that. Um, and I just think that I'm really lucky to have the series of jobs that I've had, uh, which I definitely got like purely by luck. I got this job at First Second. My resume ended up on Mark's desk because I went to a book festival and met his boss's boss and gave him my resume without knowing that he was the the boss of someone who was a comics imprint person.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I feel so lucky to have gotten that job, and even more lucky to have the job that I have now,
Yeah.
and get a salary that includes health insurance that's robust enough that I can live in New York City and still eat. And there's so many people working in comics who just like don't have any of that security,
Mm-hmm.
and that I just feel like I have to I have to do something else in addition to kind of like being good at my job.
Yeah.
And so that's why I used to work with Mocha. I did all this work with TCAF, and it's part of the reason why Allison and I do graphic novel TK.
Mm-hmm. Before we jump into Random House, let's talk about the podcast really quick. So, for listeners that don't know, graphic novel TK is largely you and Allison sharing all of the, with guests, kind of examining all the things that go into releasing your own graphic novel. That's why it's Graphic Novel TK, which is publishing shorthand for To Come. So why did you decide to do that? Was that just kind of filling that other role that you wanted to do to kind of pay it back to comics and everything like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it. It's also something that Allison and I saw a real need for.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, I feel like neither she or I feels like we've been in comics like a super long time. There's definitely people who are more senior than we are, but we both have been in this new publishing graphic novel category just about as long as anyone, because it's as you said, it kind of started being out there in 2005, and both she and I, whenever we would go out to dinner with friends, hang out with people after our conference, um, be talking on Twitter, be emailing with people, doing podcasts, like any of this stuff, we would get inquiries from people that were like, wait, you just said something, I don't understand what you mean. Or my publisher asked me to do this thing. Are they taking advantage of me? Or I think something's gone terribly wrong. That it's right that something's gone terribly wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the answers to those questions were, actually, that's just how publishing works, and no one explained it to you.
Right.
Um, and so she and I had these conversations so many times. And Allison is a big podcast fan, and I am less of a big podcast fan. But she was like, we should just do a podcast and we should just talk to all of these people and break down all the parts, from putting a pitch together, from what an agent does, from working with an editor, to marketing and publicity and distribution and bookstores, and what people need to know so they're not messing something up in a completely avoidable way. Because, like when I was at First Second, when I'm at Random House, like we do have a guide for authors that's just like, hey, here's how our company works. Here's what you should expect. But it's like 3 pages long.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I think we're on the 23rd hour long episode of this podcast now, and we are maybe 2/3 of the way through. So there's obviously a lot more that can be said about all of this. Also, doing this podcast, I've actually basically like learned something every episode, even with people I'm like, I've known you for 10 years. How did I not know this about how your job works? So it's really been a super helpful part of starting a publisher to kind of get this intensive tutorial on how publishing works in all these different aspects.
Yeah, yeah. And now, a word from our sponsor. Yo, everybody. I'd like to take a minute to talk about our sponsors over at Impact Theory Comics. Impact Theory Comics is a new independent publisher, and they're releasing their first comic, Neon Future. Neon Future is a collaboration with world-famous DJ and producer Steve Aoki, and is written by the Eisner Award-winning writer of Justice, Jim Kruger, with artists Neil Edwards of Fantastic Four fame and Jeremy Rappak delivering the visuals and building the world. Want a first look at the book and Neil and Jeremy's art? Give Impact Theory a follow on Instagram at IT Comics. If you like what you see and you're a fan of science fiction, this might be the comic for you. So head over to your local comic book shop and get Neon Future #1 on your pull list ASAP. And now, back to the show. Well, that's actually a perfect transition into talking about Random House Graphic, which, as I mentioned in the intro, is the new imprint that focuses on developing comics for children and teenagers at Random House. You're the publishing director of it. You know, I just want to start the very basic question of how did that come together? Was this something that you were approached for, or was it something that you helped build a vision for, or what was the origin of this?
Yeah, so this is something that I was approached for.
Okay.
Random House is really great. They they'd been seeing what First Second and what Scholastic Graphics and publishers like Boom and Oni and Nobrow had been doing with kids comics, and they basically, before they came and talked to me, they spent like 2 years talking to anyone who was a senior person in comics in New York, or anyone who was a senior person in comics who like came to New York at any point. So they called me and I was like, oh, like they finally got down the ladder as far as me to talk to me about how I think comics publishers should be organized.
Mm-hmm.
And um, because I knew so many other people who went to talk to them, and I'm like, they're clearly doing these like fact finding, what should we do with graphic novels at Random House? And so I went off to lunch with the associate publisher of Random House Children's Books, and I was like, hey, like, let me tell you about First Second and how I think it really works, and um, what I think of the comics market. And at the end of the lunch, she was like, would you ever consider coming over to Random House? And I was like, I'm really committed to First Second. And, like it would have to be a big offer from you to make me leave, because I loved working at First Second. I love that team. I love all the authors who are there. They have a fantastic list. And I like just told Random House that I wouldn't be willing to move for anything less than kind of an imprint,
Mm-hmm.
because that's the format that I think really works for graphic novels and publishing houses, rather than a kind of like a single staff person with no editorial, design, and marketing and publicity backup.
Right.
And so I was like, I have a list of people you could talk to who are graphic novel editors you could look at hiring. Here's a list. They're all really great. And then I was like, okay, we're never going to see each other again. And then they called me back a few times to talk more. And 6 months later, I had the job running a new graphic novel imprint.
That's amazing. That's fantastic. So did you, because you were really at First Second right at its foundation, one of the core questions I have is like, when you look at something like this, if you try to just think about it on a macro level, it's going to be horrific to think about. It's like, how do I even do this? Like, it's a new imprint. I'm building something from scratch. Did your time being there at the ground floor with First Second help you when you started thinking about how you're going to approach where and how to start with Random House Graphic?
I mean, it did. I think that it lets me feel a lot less freaked out,
Sure.
because I feel like with the connections I have now and with the knowledge I have about how to publish graphic novels, I know so much more than any of us did at that company then. I mean, that company to start off with, I mean, First Second is amazing, and we definitely were putting our hearts into it, but it was like me, and I had no experience doing marketing and publicity, and I wasn't sure that was what I wanted to do. Danica Novgorodoff, who is the designer, and she's amazing. She does her own graphic novels now. But she hadn't ever designed a graphic novel before. She was just like, she read them and was interested in them and was like, I can figure this out. And then Mark, who came from Simon and Schuster as a designer and hadn't ever edited or acquired anything until he started at First Second, working with a whole team who was like, okay, like we're used to making picture books in production. Like, what are the specs of graphic novels supposed to be like? We don't really get it. And that's like the space where I am now, working with the team at Random House who publishes Hilo, who publishes Five Worlds, who has the experience working with Pantheon for so many years, and, working with the team where the senior editor at Random House Graphic worked at Boom for 6 years. Our designer has been running his own small press for 6 years and knows things about design that art design and production people are like, what are you saying? This is like, they're just all like blown out of the water. Um, it's a completely different place to start up a publisher. And it's a place that when I started back in 2005, like we couldn't have hired people with those skills because the companies just weren't there. And the type of publishing that we're doing now wasn't there.
Hmm. Yeah, that's one of the interesting things I don't think people realize about tackling an endeavor like this is I think this was on your Twitter a while back, but I remember there was a picture you shared that was just of all the different sizes your books could be. They were just like these white blocks of like potential comic shapes. And it's like that's one of the things you have to figure out. Like, do you want your books to be, like First Second has like kind of a general shape to theirs. And then like, manga has its shape and et cetera, et cetera. Like form kind of dictates some of what you're going to be doing and some of the effectiveness you could have in the market and things like that. When you first started, building Random House Graphic, like what would, I don't know. I mean, I guess like it's such an immersive thing. Like, where do you start?
Um, let's see. So I guess where I started was I made a list of all the authors that I wanted to work with. And my boss made a list for me of all of the directors of the departments at Random House Children's Books. And she was like, get in touch with all these people and schedule an hour to sit down with them and figure out what their job is and how you need to work with them.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I emailed all those directors of departments at Random House Children's Books, and I emailed it was like 140 authors that I wanted to work with. And then I got a list of agents that Random House Children's Books work with, and I emailed all of them. And I took the list of agents that I'd worked before and emailed all of them also. And then I sat down and made a list of all the people I should talk to about possibly hiring.
Mm-hmm. The first two people you hired, you mentioned already, but I mean, amongst them was Whitney Leopard from Boom, who actually, she was working at the Kaboom part of Boom, so the kids' books, is your senior editor. I did want to ask her about her in specific, like what made her a great fit, and how important was it to have like, another perspective on the staff of like somebody else who could bring like, other books, acquire other books that you wouldn't necessarily think about.
Yeah. So I said that, one of the things I sat down to do first thing was emailing authors and agents, and I did that.
Mm-hmm.
And from that point to the point that I hired Whitney, I have been acquiring books and editing books. But following hiring Whitney, she has really taken on that responsibility primarily and has taken over most of the books and is kind of the primary point person for authors and agents. I still am acquiring stuff occasionally, but I came out of marketing and publicity. That's my background. And there's all the stuff that goes on in publishing that's about making relationships, deciding on trim sizes, figuring out like the systems and the organization, managing a team of people, kind of figuring out the launch of an imprint that falls on my shoulders, which means that having someone in the editorial role who can acquire and edit things is essential, because doing all of that as well as editing everything, it's a huge task.
Mm-hmm. I imagine so.
It leads to a lot of people who are publishers or publishing directors, editing books on weekends, on evenings, on the subway, on the way to work, and editing still isn't my like absolute favorite thing.
Hmm.
Um, doing all the translation line edits so many years ago has kind of left me in this space where I'm like, I would love it if this was like one of the many responsibilities that I have, but not the only thing that I do with all of my time.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that, if I've never run like a publishing house or an imprint or anything like that, but to me, it seems like you probably know your strengths and you know what you like to do. And so I imagine most people who are in your position who have the opportunity to hire other people for roles, you probably lean towards what your strengths are, which, you probably still enjoy do marketing and publicity and everything like that. So maybe you play more in that realm and you let Whitney do her part and you let your designer, Patrick Crotty, like do things in that regard. And so then it allows you to focus on the parts of the equation that you prefer.
Yeah. And, hiring an editor and a designer, like they're really the point person with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we're such a small team. And it's just hiring people in other roles. Like the point isn't for them to do exactly what I want. The point is for our team to be exponentially empowering us, right? For them to be able to bring their opinion and perspective and have that be the center point and have us all contribute to it, to make it more like useful and exciting and interesting, but not for it all to be about me.
Right. I do want to talk about the development of the line. You said that when you first started, you put together a list of 140 names that you might want to work with and everything like that. And near as I can tell, after going through your Twitter feed relentlessly, it looks like you have about 19 books acquired or at least announced so far. When you're doing that, is your goal? Do you look at names of people to work with, or are you trying to find both those names and also um I don't know. I want to say like filling niches, like find stories that are underrepresented in what you're trying to do. Like, what is your strategy for curating this line when you're building it from scratch?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely both, right? You want authors that you really like, whose work that you really like. Through starting this publisher, I've met so many new amazing authors and illustrators and seen the work of so many more people. So that's definitely an amazing bonus for this job. So one of the things that you want to do is work with super talented, great people. But then, we are as you said, we're a kids and YA publisher, right? So we cover a whole swath of ages from 5 to college. And our mandate as a publisher is that we publish books for every kid, so whether they're interested in animals or fantasy adventure, we want there to be graphic novels for them. So the amazing authors is part of it, but the other part is, well, there's three parts, I guess. Amazing authors is part of it. Another part of it is amazing books, right? Because when you have an amazing author, you need to also get an amazing pitch from them
Right.
for something that you're like, this is the thing that is going to, make your name in graphic novels, that's going to make people excited about you, that's going to make it worthwhile to have spent 2 years on this. Um, and then the third thing is that doing this variety of ages and looking for this variety of subjects, we have to have a lot of stuff that is different from each other.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not just publishing one age category. We're not just publishing one genre. We're looking to have some of everything, graphic novel for every kid.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, so for example, witches, people are really excited about witches. And I think we now have a sufficient amount of books about witches that we can't buy any more books about witches. So we have a number of really great pitches that are about witches, and I still can't buy any of them. even if they're an author that I want to work with, and even if the story is really good.
It must have been really hard in there to say witches pitches because I kept wanting to say it for you. Um, you do. I mean, I have to admit, like of the three, I think you have three witch centric books that are announced, like Aster and the Accidental Magic. I don't know if that's technically witch specific. That book looks fantastic. It really does.
It's super fun. There is a not really magical but slightly magical talking dog. But no witches in it.
Well, it looks great. The other two also look great. I mean, that is one of the things I think is really interesting is just looking at the line how I don't know it's very diverse. Like even the places where you get the books from. For example, Suncatcher was a Kickstarter. It's a book by Jose Pimienta, if I pronounce that correctly. I'm sorry, Jose, if I didn't. But that book looks fantastic. You also fill one of my favorite niches that I always wish there was more in comics, which is food books. Yummy looks great as well, and it's a food book, so I obviously will be reading that. But that is the reason why you try not to have these books kind of encroach in the same territory. Is that primarily like a marketing purpose? Like you don't want to have too many books kind of competing for the same area and same age groups for, the people who might potentially be buying these?
I mean, it's definitely some of that, right? Like you don't want to have two books about the nonfiction history of food coming out within a year of each other. I mean, that would just be kind of a silly strategy to publish things. And it's also just with that mandate of a graphic novel for every kid, you can see how much space you're not taking up when you sit down and think about it. Patrick and Whitney and I sat down last week and we had a brainstorming meeting where we were like, what things do we need to get on our list that we should really make sure we have that some kid is going to be like and really be excited about. And then we made a list of them and it was like a page long of just areas that we hadn't bought a book by, a book that covered. And you just look at that and you're like, yeah, like if there's an amazing contemporary book or amazing fantasy adventure or amazing autobio book, like, yeah, we'll totally look at it. We'll totally try to buy it. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we don't have an imprint that says, if you're a girl who likes magical fantasy and reading, comics are for you, but not if you're a boy who likes sports.
Mm-hmm.
Because that is not helpful to anyone. I mean, it's helpful to the girls who like magical and fantasy and reading, like myself. But like, just think how much better comics would be if it wasn't just for one demographic of people.
Right. Yeah, that was. I mean, and that's one of the interesting things too, though, is I don't remember who wrote it, but I read an article in the last like 6 months or so where it was the person was talking about it was a cartoonist who was talking about how often they have to deal with the preconceived notion that a book for girls is not for boys, and I imagine
it was probably Shannon Hale.
Was it Shannon Hale?
I mean, that is a thing that she talks about all the time because people are always coming and talking to her about how Princess in Black and Real Friends are so great and how she should write a book for boys.
Oh, yeah.
And she's always just like, my book has a girl in it. If you know girl children who like Harry Potter, your boy children can read this book about a princess who wears a mask and fights crime.
Right. I mean, it would be like this Amulet by Kazu Kibuishi is a massive hit, and it's a great series. And Emily is the lead character of that series. I find it astonishing that somebody would be like, well, it's got a girl lead character, so you can't. But those people totally exist. It's such an odd preconceived notion there. But I do like the idea of finding a comic for every kid, and I do like that you mentioned sports comics because I always feel like there should be more sports comics. I do want to also compliment you because you certainly have the market cornered on infrastructure comics because Hidden Systems actually looks and sounds great.
It's so good. Dan is working on the short comic, Not For Us, about democracy right now.
Hmm.
And he was in New York and he came by and gave us a copy of it. And I read it this afternoon and it's so good. Like, so good at taking these complex topics and boiling them down in a thoughtful and interesting way. And yeah, this is going to be great. We're going to learn all the things about the water system
That's awesome.
and the internet.
How much time do you spend reading? Like, it just seems like it has to be a very important part of your world. A good thing that you read a book a day.
Yeah. So I do, in fact, usually read about a book a day. And in addition to that, I read comics as well. Um, so I I live in Brooklyn. I work in New York. My commute is about 50 minutes.
Oh,
And so then that's one way. So I take books with me on the train and I get in almost 2 hours of reading on the subway every day. And that comes out to about a book a day for me. And in addition to that, I read a lot of graphic novels, which I don't read on the subway because they don't take 50 minutes. And so they're so short that I have to bring so many of them that it's like not bag space optimized.
that's amazing. I'm very envious of your reading skills. You are clearly also a very fast reader.
Yes.
I've seen some of the books that you're reading in your commute, and that is pretty amazing. Actually, and I do want to compliment you on another thing. Your Twitter feed is so positive. I love it. It's just awesome books you're reading and ice cream, which is a great mix.
Thank you. Yes, I only put books on my Twitter that I actually liked and thought were useful. Of the things that I read, I actually read more than is up on my Twitter.
Oh.
And, uh, but I also like dessert a whole lot. So whenever I'm eating something particularly interesting, I will put a photo up of it. And um, yeah, ice cream is one of the things that I have some interesting kinds now and then. New York is a really good ice cream city.
I imagine so. I had the misfortune of having just eaten dinner when I was reading through stuff for researching this podcast, and when I was met with a stream of ice cream pictures, I ended up eating ice cream myself because I could not resist. So, thank you, and how dare you? It's a it's a deadly combination.
Yeah, I learned how to make granita this winter, which I hadn't known how to make before. And it turns out to be very good and easy and a fun ice cream substitute.
What is granita exactly?
So granita it's basically like ice crystals. So the way you make it is uh, you I made a like a milky coffee version. So you basically you make coffee, you put milk or cream in it, and then you put it in a very shallow pan in the freezer. So it's maybe like a quarter inch of coffee on the bottom of it, and then you just check it every 15 minutes, and you take a fork and you kind of comb the fork through it so that it doesn't harden into a block so that you're kind of like constantly turning it over so it just forms tiny crystals
Hmm.
and eventually it just settles into these tiny crystals and not into a block at all and you can just eat it. It's like shave ice,
Yeah.
which is also not Alaskan. um,
We actually, fun fact for you, despite the fact Alaska is incredibly cold and is very famous for that, Alaskans eat more ice cream than any state per capita. We love shaved ice.
Amazing. So
Yeah.
it's like shave ice. It's kind of like a like a snow cone,
Sure.
except that instead of being like a solid block of a cone, it's tiny crystals. The crystals are smaller than the crystals in shave ice.
I have to admit, I was sitting there with my jaw dropped the entire time because I want to eat that right now. Um,
It's very easy. I recommend it. I thought it was going to be much harder than it was.
it sounds like a high variance food. Like, have you ever made risotto?
Yes.
Risotto is incredibly, it's like if it's right, and if it's wrong, it goes really wrong. In my experience, maybe I'm just not very good at making risotto. But, um, anyways, well, I just have a couple more questions about Random House Graphic.
Hey, you don't want to talk about food some more?
I believe me, I would. I if I do though, I'm probably going to eat my microphone, which would be a
Oh
problem.
no.
Not that I'm that hungry. I just like I I love food. Actually, and that would be a very fitting aside to talking about Lucy Nicely because I have Relish like sitting 3 feet to my left, and
Gosh, it's so good.
I love that. I don't know. It was nice. It was very fitting symmetry that one of your first signings, actually, I think your first announced signing was somebody that you worked with quite a bit at First Second.
Yeah. I mean, I think Lucy's amazing, and I was super happy to learn that she wanted to work with me over at Random House, which is not something that I expected. I She's still doing her adult books over at First Second, and I know her editor over there, Callista, like thinks that she's amazing. So I was pretty shocked to learn that she was thinking about doing middle grade and wanted to do it with me. But it's really cool. We just got the first 30 pages of her book with us today, and it looks so great. It's autobiographically based, so it's about her alter ego, whose name is Jen. And she and her mom move upstate New York, and they start a farm together. And then her mom starts dating this new guy who has two daughters of his own. And the daughters come to stay with them on the weekends. And she's like, what is this?
I really, I'm trying to remember the name of the book that she did that was in France, where it was her and her mom.
It's
Uh,
called French Milk.
French Milk, yes, I love that book. That book is so great. I appreciate her for her affinity for food, but also just the all the. She's just a fantastic cartoonist. I really love her stuff. But I did want to ask because you also acquired two picture books from her. I'm curious how things like that, and then some of the existing like Random House children's books things exist next to what you're doing. Like for like the particular the Random House children's book line, like that features like Judd Winnick's Hilo. Is it Hilo or is it Hilo?
Hello, yeah.
Hilo, and then things like even DC Superhero Girls is it was published through them. Does that do those things influence like what niche you're looking to fill? Because those are being published by Random House, or are you still just in your own domain?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a few different answers for this. So let me try to break them all down.
Sure.
So Lucy Knisley, um, her agent came to me to talk about these middle grade graphic novels, and there's a larger group of publishers that I'm part of, specifically at Random House Children's Books. There's a few different imprints there. So whenever something that is really cool and exciting comes across my desk with submissions, I take it to this Tuesday meeting that we have that's called the editorial meeting, where the publishers or their kind of second in command people come and they say, hey, this is on the horizon. I'm looking at this. So when I did that, the people at Knopf, which is our sister company, said, we work with Lucy on picture books. They did this picture book called Margaret and the Moon. And we were all super excited about the thought of having her at Random House. And they said, can we sign up some picture books with her too? So that's that's kind of an interesting collaboration, I think, that can happen because of the structure of this company, where if you have authors who do graphic novels, but who also do other kinds of work. We only do graphic novels at Random House Graphic, but there's a whole lot of other imprints who do YA novels, who do picture books, who do chapter books, who do illustrated chapter books, who, need covers for their middle grade and YA novels, who need interior illustrators for their chapter books. And so there can be a lot of synchronicity there. So then you also asked about what the rest of Random House Children's Books is publishing. And yeah, I talk a lot to all of the editors at Random House Children's Books about graphic novels and what they're doing, because you were talking about Judd Winnick's Hilo, which just hit the New York Times bestseller list, which is super exciting. Yeah, those books are super fun. I tried to read one of them on the subway the other day, and there was a small child who was reading over my shoulder so intently that I ended up giving him my copy of the latest book.
Oh, that's amazing.
I just was like, I must sacrifice this for the greater good.
You may have just made a lifetime comic fan there.
Here's hoping. Yeah. So, I look at that book and it's like kids, contemporary, robots, and I definitely want to know kind of everything that Judd and Shayna, his editor, are planning there, because I don't want to sign up a book that's like contemporary kids, adventure, friendship, robots in the same way. Especially not one that's coming out the same season as the latest volume of Hilo.
Mm-hmm.
Which is not to say that I, couldn't do a younger kids and robots book or kids and robots book in a different way than robots coming to fight everyone sort of episodic situation. But publishing two books that are kind of really tonally close at the same time is not ideal.
Right.
So, I get to decide with Whitney and Patrick kind of what is right for our imprint and how to publish things. But part of that is, making sure that there's a moment and a thing that's kind of special and different about every book that we publish. So we just have to figure that out.
Mm-hmm.
Random House Children's Books is really the set of imprints that we think about when we think about who to balance that with. Random House is extremely large. Penguin is also part of Random House. Random House also has, it's like 100 and something maybe distribution clients, or that could be wrong. They could have many fewer distribution clients, but they have a lot of distribution clients, which is other publishers who are their own publishers who just work with Random House to get distributed.
Mm-hmm.
And they distribute DC, they distribute Dark Horse, they distribute No Brow, they distribute New York Review of Books, Comics, they distribute Titan, they distribute IDW Top Shelf. So many people. There's more comics people than that. They distribute Kodansha. This list keeps going on. And that team, that sales team, is a different team. And we don't keep a close eye on them except in the way that we do the rest of the industry. We kind of think first about Random House, and then, we pay attention to, DC's new line of kids and YA books, but that sort of licensed book isn't kind of the main goal of our imprint. So we kind of look at that and we're like, well, this is really interesting and we should see how it goes. And then if it's going in an interesting way, we should talk to our licensing people at Random House Children's Books and figure out if there's a plan to be made here.
Yeah, it seems to me that if you tried to pay attention to all of those things, it would be, I don't know, kind of crippling to your line. It's like if you try to factor in everything that is possibly happening outside of the way that you typically think about it, you would, I don't know, there'd be a lot of bases that would be covered and perhaps you couldn't publish because of that. So it's like you have to think about what you offer.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of industry research that's involved in my job. I read multiple publishing e-newsletters every day. I look at industry numbers from BookScan in the graphic novel category on a weekly basis to see what's selling, what's changing week by week. Um, I look at a lot of comics news websites and a lot of comics articles. I read a lot of other publishers' catalogs. I look at books that are coming out. I go to conventions and festivals and talk to publishers and authors about what they're doing. So definitely, I'm keeping all of that on the radar, uh, but not as much of a we can't publish this because we already have one of these
Sure.
when it's not actually Random House children's books.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I just have two more questions. One of the questions, I mean, I want to start in the very basic, like, this is where you're going type thing. It seems like everything that you've acquired or announced so far is being released in 2020. Is that what you're looking at right now?
Yeah, so 2020 is our first year, and then we'll also be, publishing things in subsequent years also.
Okay, great. Well, I'm very excited for that. But the last thing I want to ask about is really about just what people might not know or expect about this whole process. I mean, I'm sure that there is like books. I mean, there is an entire podcast dedicated to what they don't know about publishing graphic novels. But what is something that people might not expect from the process of starting up an imprint like this, like of getting it all together? And like I referenced earlier, like I never even thought about trying to find the right size for your books, like what the right fit is. Like, what is one thing that perhaps surprised even you once you went through the process of all this?
Um, well, I guess the one thing that surprised me was I went to Angoulême recently, which is this big French comics festival that also has a kind of rights market where you go to talk to people about foreign rights for your books and foreign rights for their books. And I was talking to a few different people about the list that I'm putting together, and multiple people said to me, like, I can tell this is you. Like, I can tell that this is a list that you are building because I've known you. And like, this isn't a list that someone else would put together. And then I looked at the list that I put together and I'm like, okay, ice cream, witches, queerness. Like, yes, this is definitely all like, I can see how you would see that. But it wasn't something that I kind of like went into building the list and said each of these books is going to reflect, something that I am interested in and engaged with personally. Which is why I think it's really good that, now I've hired some people and we're kind of a team looking at these things all together. But it is like having that happen. It's fascinating to look at the list that I put together and then also to look at other publishers' lists
Mm.
and think about how much they're a reflection of specifically the people who work there.
Hmm. Yeah, I've always found that kind of interesting because it's especially when you're dealing with imprints or other publishers. Like, Whitney came from Boom, where somebody like Shannon Waters really put her fingerprints all over that, and I think that's really great. Or even if you look at some like specific editors, like at Marvel, there's Will Moss who's the editor of The Unbeatable Squirrel Girl, amongst other things, and I feel like you kind of know what a Will Moss book is. Not in like it's like I will know every book that Will Moss would ever edit, but at the same time it's like I kind of have a feel of what he looks for. And I think that's kind of cool. But do you feel like is that something that you feel like, now that you've expanded your team, but do you feel like that's something you have to try to escape from so you don't, have one specific brand? Or is it good to have that specific brand where people know what to expect from your line?
I mean, I think it's six of one, half dozen of another, right? Because I don't know, like I think it's good to have a team of people who kind of poke me every so often and are like, we should really do some sports books. If we can find some really good ones, so that it's not just kind of me inside my head all the time. And hopefully either way, I would get out of my head, right? Because I mean, one of the things I love about books is that sometimes you get a book and you read it and you know about a whole thing that you didn't know before. And it could be a fiction book or a nonfiction book, but you read it and you're like, the person who's the protagonist of this book is obsessed with medieval history. And now I know all this stuff about medieval history that I didn't know before. And you can kind of like catch their contagious excitement and enthusiasm.
Hmm.
And, I don't think it's helpful for anyone to just be like, well, I'm not interested in medieval history. So, despite this book being by an author that I really like and about time travel, which I really do like, I'm not going to pick it up because, my medieval history background is nil.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the interesting things is like sometimes you can have preconceived notions of what will or won't work as a story or something like that. Like, in the nonfiction realm, one of my favorite articles I've read in the last like 5 years was an article about a small, like, it's like a very esteemed, beloved chess tournament that takes place in this tiny chess club, I believe in New York, and it featured all the greatest players in the world. And there's this writer from Slate who went to go cover it, and it was this massive piece that was just all about like the political nature of it and all the different relationships and all the characters that were involved. And I played chess when I was a kid, and I do enjoy chess, but it's not like something I go out of my way to read about. But that was one of the interesting things is like I still think about it to this day. Like I think it came out like 5 years ago, and I think it was partially because it exposed me to a world that I'm not used to. Or like, here's another good example is I loved Tilly Walden's On a Sunbeam. Uh,
So good.
it's fantastic. But I mean, that isn't necessarily a book I would normally read, but it exposed me to a lot of stuff that I wouldn't have thought about. And it was such a rewarding read because of that.
Yeah, I mean, here's another example. That last example was from Connie Willis's The Doomsday Book. But I also read the Sarah Paretsky mysteries, um, which are about a female detective in Chicago in like the 90s. And she just investigates a lot of different things. And the last one, her name is V. Warshawski, and she's great. The last one I read, she got into this whole situation where she was like investigating the prison industrial complex because she's like, something is happening here that's not right. And I read this book and I was like, I've heard about problems in prison. Like, I think that there's a lot of laws today that put people in prison for an unjust amount of time. Like, there are, I went into this thinking like this is a system that there are a lot of problems with. And then I read this book and I'm like, there's so many problems that I didn't have any idea about.
Right.
And also they're really narratively interesting.
Hmm.
And um, like now I'm coming out of this with like more engaged with the idea of prison reform and with a better idea of like what people should actually do about it.
Hmm. That's amazing. I mean, like that is the magic of reading, isn't it? Like where
Yeah.
you can be exposed to these different things, and you can be more engaged with it afterwards. I think that's the sign that you read something very, very good. But anyways, well, Gina, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about all of this at Random House Graphic, your background, everything else. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, it was really good to talk to you. Thanks for having me.
Before we go, I want to give a special shout out to Sean Kirkham, aka Big Clutch, one of Off Panel's patrons. Off Panel is now going to have a special dedicated segment at the end of each episode where I highlight a comic or creator that has been impressing me lately. It's called Big Clutch's Beast of the Week, and this segment will sometimes feature guests and sometimes not. This week's first edition will, because Sean Kirkham, Big Clutch himself, is joining us to highlight his own Beast of the Week. Sean, let's start with you. Who is your pick of the week?
All right, so I'm going to go with this one. It's a friend of yours, a friend of mine, John Hendrick from Big Bang out in Ireland. Last week, he was inducted into the ICN Hall of Fame class of 2019. And for those of you who don't read and don't know, that ICN is the Irish Comic News. I actually thought it was just the Ireland Hall of Fame, and I was like, that's a pretty big honor. Like, he's going to be full on, like, he's all of Ireland's Hall of Fame, but I think Irish Comic News is good too.
Yeah. Oh, and if you don't know, John is the owner of Big Bang Comics in Dublin. Amazing shop, super good guy. Even though today he was kind of mean to me on Twitter, so I don't know. Oh. I totally support this because John was kind of a jerk, but I also did tweet about how he was such a good guy and how helpful he has been to. I don't know. There was this comics helping hand hashtag going around on Twitter today, and John is.
Oh yeah, solid.
He's just a great guy.
He's amazing. He's one of the. I met him at Comics for a couple of years ago, and literally, like, within like 3 hours, became one of my favorite people of all time. So absolutely good.
Is it because you bonded over Wildstorm?
Yes. We were at the hotel bar. Jim Lee was around the corner. We kept oogling and ogling and just getting slack-jawed at how amazing Jim Lee was, and then we just kept drinking beers. So 2 good things, and that's all that matters.
All right. Well, I'm going to, for my Beast of the Week, for my first ever one, I'm going to give one to a Skybound creator, but not because he's Skybound and not because I'm sucking up to you by any means. It's because it's Daniel Warren Johnson, and he is the definitive art beast of our time.
Oh, he is 100% beast.
Oh, yeah. I mean, so the 5th issue of Murder Falcon came out, I think, last week, which I think would be 2 weeks before this airs. You know, the thing that really amazes me about that book is every single issue is completely spectacular, but always in slightly different ways, in ways that kind of continuously surprise me. Like there was a new character that was introduced in this 5th issue, 5th of 8, I believe, and he's so badass, and I love him, and there's so many nice wrinkles to it, but and also it always shocks me with how amazing his visuals are and how much emotional depth he can get into a story called Murder Falcon, which is about metal-powered avatars of justice. I mean, it's kind of astonishing, really.
Yeah, I think one of his masterful things is that he can get so much emotion in this story, and it's just like it is epic and it's crazy and it's over top, but then it's like it's got these real like human moments in there, and it's just like, wow, this guy can literally do it all. Like, that's the definition of a beast for sure.
Oh yeah. Oh, and one other thing I wanted to shout out was the fact he actually managed to work a workable guitar jam into the issue that people are actually playing online. Like, I saw a video of Kevin Mellon playing it, artist Kevin Mellon, and I was like, first off, that is awesome. Second off, he's like, I don't know, that gets a hell of a like level of fan engagement into it. Not that Kevin is necessarily a fan, but at the same time, it's still really impressive. I think it's just, Daniel's such a good guy. It's amazing.
I hate him.
So you hate my Beast of the Week, and I hate your Beast of the Week. It started out perfectly.
I can't wait till next week. This is going to be really intense.
All right, that's it for the first edition of Big Clutch's Beast of the Week. Look for these to close each week's episode. If not every week, then most every week. So thank you, Sean.
Rock on, man.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with Random House Graphics publishing director Gina Gagliano. You can find her on Twitter at _Gina Gagliano, and her work in the upcoming Young Readers graphic novel imprint at Random House Graphic. If you're a fan of Off Panel, make sure to check it out on Patreon. If you back the show on there, you not only support it, but you get early access to each week's podcast, access to exclusive written and audio content, and more. Also, don't forget to subscribe to Off Panel on iTunes or Stitcher and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. You can find Off Panel on social media by liking it on Facebook at /sketched, that's SKTECHD, following on Twitter at @sketchedcomic, or following me at @slicefriedgold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Wesley Gift, Sean Kirkham, Harry Small, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Greg Peterson, Gus, Andrew Scott, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Johan Brander, Paul Reinwan, Connor Farner, Vida Ayala, JDC and Matt Gagnon, Aditya Bidikar, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, Kieran Mark Antonio, WMQ Comics, Akil, Greg Lockhart, Kokachi, Phil White, Ben Becker, Sean Pinello, Ken Heidelman, Philip Savy, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, Nick Michelin, David Kelly, Robert Wilson IV, Nick Paletto, Owen McCready, Brendan Fletcher, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogert, Xavier Files, Maria Schweitzer, Matthew Taylor, Tyler Turner, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Evan Blazer, Brian McRae, Ira James Udaskin, Modern Magic Stories, Nick Hall, Bruno Batista, Bobby Angus, Bjorn Basin, John Hendrick, Steve Anderson, Phil Nall, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Shipper, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Maxwell Schmidt, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Lou Iovino, Nicholas Kesslake, Greg Rucka, Adam Highfield, Nicholas Gardner, Andrew Corrigan, Fiona Staples, Chris Morris, Chris O'Halloran, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim DiMonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to the band Wolfpack, whose excellent track Outro from the album Volmilch opens the show. Give them a listen as they're totally rad. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.